technology. It's like really interesting. You're live. Yay. All right. Okay. Okay. So moving on, let's make it so that we can see what our lecture notes are saying. Got to make them bigger, right? Last we stopped off with was talking about development from the inside, development from the outside, right? Self-determination, human rights, development, sustainable development, all those concepts, okay? Moving on from there, we're going to do a basic review of our case of Awas Tingni. Now, we've been listening to bits and pieces of this case throughout the semester, right? And so we know a fair amount, but we're going to bring it all together and talk about all the methods and how we did it and all those details, okay? Right. So first of all, important to notice that this group called Awas Tingni is a territory. They're Mayagna territory. There are 9 Mayagna territories in Nicaragua. There are other Mayagna territories in Honduras, just across the other side of the Coco River, right? Not distinguishable by nation-state boundaries or current new nation-state boundaries, right? In this case, we've got a group that's been fighting for about 35 years. 35 years, right? Remember, the declaration was in draft for 35 years. This group has also been fighting for 35 years, if not longer, in terms of other kinds of interactions they had all the way back to the 1500s, right? Okay, so what we have is a new issue to deal with because we have squatters that are in their territory, squatters that are cutting down their trees, right? So we got to talk a little bit about the background, right? So beginning 1979, 1980, all the way through 1990, we have our Sandinista-Contra War. Now, just to remind you, we had a fair amount of indigenous discontent, right? When we had some decisions being made from the Sandinista government. And that was related to their trees. We had, after the dictatorship, the Somoza dictatorship, we understand that the vast majority of all the lands of Nicaragua were taking into his personal coffers as his personal property. Therefore, when we changed to a different kind of a system from the dictator, all of those properties became nation-state properties in their eyes, right? So in their eyes, it wasn't a big deal to say, give a land concession to a logging company, even from a foreign country, right? And that's exactly what happened with Awas Tingni. We had foreign logging concessions that were given, right? And we had a reaction from the indigenous people that said, hey, we were never asked. This is our lands. They're never even offering to pay us anything. Cutting down all these trees are going to affect us and how we live every day, not to mention our future generations, right? So obviously they were upset, they were concerned. Similar things happened in other territories, and we know that that was one of the things that spurred the Sandinista-Contra War, right? The Contra group was actually started in Mayagna territories that were pissed as to the fact that the government was trying to take their trees, right? And we were listening, especially CIA, right? Okay, so we came in through Honduras as a CIA group, armed those indigenous people, and instantly formed what we called the Contra resistance. Now, if you remember, the Mayagna homelands were the front lines of the conflict, right? Where it started. And in that sense, we also had a division of those clan groups of the Mayagna people into Sandinista and Contra, meaning they had to fight each other. Why was that? Because they were the ones that knew the forest the most, right? So we had the men, especially the men in the communities, taken to one side, and then the men in the communities taken to the other side. Therefore, we had the people that knew the forest best that were leading the conflict, which meant aunties, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, all fighting each other, right? Medical anthropology, we talked about greasy sickness, how it might be related somehow to trauma, dealing with this reality of an indigenous group is essentially forced to fight itself, right? It's just devastating to think about it, right? 40,000 indigenous people broken in two, forced to be the ones in the forefront of their civil war of the nation state. Okay, all right, so we had various uprisings of concern for Awas Tingni. We went to court on various occasions. Finally, we got to a point in the 2000 timeframe where we had exhausted all the measures in country. This is what you have to do. You can't go outside of the country to deal with human rights issues until you've exhausted all measures inside. Can't go to any higher levels in the OAS or the UN or any other higher courts until you've exhausted everything in country. And that's what we did. 2001, then we went to the Inter-American Human Rights Court and we won, right? We won. This little indigenous tribe, 40,000 people, right? Maybe not so little, but quite frankly, a small population group won a major landmark case against the country of Nicaragua, right? Next was the idea of collecting. The fact that they're a third world country benefits us tremendously. Easy to coerce, right? And that's exactly what we did. We used the General Environment Fund of the World Bank, right, to coerce them, threaten their funding, say, you know, all that funding you get every year, right? 60 to 70% of all their annual funding was from the World Bank. We're going to cut it off unless you do this, right? Yeah. So now what? Now the country is left kind of coerced into the corner, told that they have to title indigenous lands to a group of people. Not only is it communal lands, but it's multi-communal lands, a concept we don't even have any tradition for, right? So what we had to do from the very beginning was figure out how to write laws to be able to make what we were going to do legal, right? Okay, so one of the first things we had to do was write something based on how to define people as indigenous. Yeah, we have an international definition, but countries are defining this on their own, right? What is the US definition of indigeneity according to our law? Not saying it's good. What's the definition according to law? Do you remember what it has to relate to? Blood, yeah? 25%, right? Typical percentage. You drop below that, you lose your homelands. You drop below that, you lose your benefits. Can't have rights to bilingual education, all those wonderful things, right? We call these laws genocidal or ethnocidal, right? Because that's how our country deals with it in terms of whittling away the population so there actually will be none in the future. Nicaragua was different, though. They said, we don't want to do that blood quantum thing. They said, what we want to do is we want to have groups to be able to say, yeah, this person is a member of our group. You recognize us as an indigenous group. We'll recognize who our members are. We'll tell you who they are, right? That's vastly different. We're not whittling away their population over time, right? It's a completely different approach, okay? So we had to write into law how that was recognized. And then after that, we had to say in law how we're going to go about this thing called land titling. And what if we had another indigenous territory that was their neighbor and we disagreed on the boundary? What then? Right? We have to have some kind of procedures that are normative and equal across all cases. So we had to write a law. So here we are coming down as outsiders. Remember our discussion last time? We talked about development from the outside, right? So instead of doing what you might have expected us to do, we did something completely different, and the World Bank funded it. We did a consultation of every single indigenous territory and community in the Atlantic coastal area. We went community to community, territory to territory, and said, what do you want in a land law? What do you want to do with the colonists? What do you think should be done with conflicts, right? And pretty soon we had an idea about what everybody in the country thought was what needed to happen according to law. We formulated it all together, had agreements, signed agreements, passed the law through the National Assembly, and now all of a sudden, after it's passed, all the territories in the country have a method to go to court prepared to be able to argue for their right to land. And that's what happened. It was a massive, massive rush on doing these diagnostic studies to be able to title these lands to indigenous. And it happened within a 10 to 15-year period. Just boom, 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 one after another. One group would learn how to do it and they'd train another group, right? Okay. So when we came in 2001, having had that decision from the Inter-American Human Rights Court that said you won, it's pretty amazing when you think about all that we did to be able to get on the ground. We were on the ground in 2003. That's 2 years. It took us 2 years to do full consultation of what it takes to define indigenous people, what we should do to title lands and how to do it, get the funding, right? Write the proposal, get the funding, and get on the ground and start. That's pretty fast, right? So we got on the ground in 2003, went back again in 2004, we'll talk about that, and then presented our claims in court. And 2010 and then 2012, their legal titles were guaranteed. Boy, that's a really long time after, isn't it? That's a really long time. Politics took that. Okay? All right, so when we went into documenting their right to land, we wanted to know what was the area that they claimed, obviously. What was the actual use? Were they using it presently? Was it a past use kind of thing? What was the characterization of the population? Were they very poor? Did they depend on the forest? What was their educational level like? And we also had to go into a description of their history of the land claim because, if you remember, we had the dictator. He claimed all the lands, right? After he claimed all the lands, Nicaragua went through a process called agrarian reform, where we took vast areas of land that were titled to just a few number of people and we redistributed it. So land changed hands, titles were created, new things happened. So we had to track all that history down as well. We started off formulating our methods and presenting it to the government and state ministries. Had to be presented to the Ministry of the Environment because what we were talking about was located in the middle of a UNESCO International Biosphere Reserve. Okay, remember the Awas, right? Also, in this whole process, we talk about participatory methods, right? No way could we even do this by ourselves. I don't know Awas Tingni. I don't even know the language. It's a dialect of the language too, right? So I'm going to have to rely on those indigenous people teaching me about their place. I can't teach them about their place. I have to rely on them being a part of it and driving the project themselves as well, right? So participatory methods. Some claim that there might be a bias in this. By example, remember our talking about an interview I did where I asked people what they knew about conservation. Do you remember this conversation? And I had to use an assistant because I didn't know the language, right? And I was talking to women, they didn't speak Spanish, right? And the assistant said, you know what conservation is, don't you, right? So that's our concern, is there any bias by the people involved, right, that know what is at stake that might throw off the study, okay? Then we're going to have to develop a database with all the information we're collecting. We're collecting information out in the field, right? Using GIS, GPS, forestry techniques, but we're also collecting information on a house-to-house level, household data, right? So we need to develop some kind of a database there that we can record all of our information. And not only that, but it has to be a database that can be manageable by people that don't have maybe even a 6th grade education, okay? Counting up the data, filing it in a database, has to be done in a way that they can manage it even if they don't have a very high education. Not necessarily the case for Awas Tingni, but we have to keep those methods. All right. So then we went through a large process of training. Going to have to sit down and talk to people about what it's like to go door to door and do their household surveys of their own community. Same thing with GPS. If they don't know it, going to have to train it. One of the wonderful things that we did, though, was to work on their capacities. Remember last time, not needs, but capacities, right? What are the things that they have already? Had a lot of people that already were studying forestry. Had a lot of people that were already involved in forestry management. So identifying those that were going to be in the field was very, very simple. The community told us who they were, and they came and they were excited to work with us. So that was very, very beneficial. Had to have territorial meetings with everyone there. Everyone had to participate, and everyone had to agree as 100% consensus. This is about land. It's about ownership of land, right? Everybody's name has to be on the title. Everybody has to agree the same. So that was a bit of a process, right? Then one of the fun things that we did was we captured satellite images every 10 years starting in the 80s, right? 80s, 90s, and then into the 2000s. And one of the things that we did with that was overlay the maps of colonist communities and the maps of indigenous communities with the forest. And we saw amazing things with the forest coverage. We saw that the colonists, on an annual basis, cut down or disturbed the forest 16 to 17% a year. 16 to 17% of their forest was cut. For the indigenous people, we found plus 1% of deforestation. What does that mean? Growing. That means, yeah, they were using the forest, but they were planting it at such a rate that they were growing it. They were overplanting what they had taken. Very interesting to be able to see that data so clearly, right? And the implications. Okay. We also, when we did the mapping section, had to go through a process that we talked about in our methods class called cognitive mapping. This is where we're looking at the map that people are holding in their minds about what their place looks like, right? Not only were we to map the boundaries along the outside, but if you remember, we've got this funny little thing with Indigenous human rights where they have to prove how they're going to use it before they are going to get title, right? Crappy, right? I mean, none of the rest of us have to do this in order to get land ownership, but these guys are going to have to do that, right? So in order to talk about what's inside the map, we're going to have to go through a process of cognitive mapping where we're actually drawing this map of what we think are the hunting paths, the places where we go to collect various resources, right? Now, I think I remember talking with you about a couple of cases where we had invitations to women to come to our meetings, right? And the vast majority of them would hang out on the outside of the buildings, right, looking in through the windows, while all the men were on the inside of the meetings, right? We had most of our meetings in the primary schools, right? So all the men were inside the primary school having our meetings with us. Women were hanging around on the outside. Not participation of the women whatsoever, right? They were invited. We were attempting to get them participating, but in no way were they participating. So we had to split them off as a separate group, had focus group discussions with them, all organized by a female so that they felt comfortable with that. Had to be somebody that spoke their language, so she was from there. She was actually a trained sociologist, wonderful, right? Utilized their capacities that they had. And in that way, we were able to incorporate the female voice. Had to be real creative with that one. Lastly, when we had collected all of our data, we had to bring it all to the community and show it to them and tell them, what do you think? Do you agree? Should we go forward? Are we going to submit this plan to the state? Is this who represents us? Yeah. And after we got 100% consensus on that, then we file it with the government, and they go through a process of redoing all of their governmental maps and all of their titling. Okay. Had to do a lot of judicial analysis, looking into the historical background and even the legal identification of what occupation means, right? In order to have an area legally occupied under international law, it has to have been a nation state prior, right? Like Hawaii, right? And had to look into communal property. This was different than any other idea. Remember, we talked about this. We have communal property and we have multi-communal property. Had to do some special activities with trying to figure out all the details of their cultural traditions of property, right? Okay, so we did quite a bit with that project, including ethno-mapping, zoning traditional areas, land use as well, shared uses. We still had to put down conflicts that we had with neighboring areas if there were conflicting claims, right? So we didn't have that problem with ignoring what had existed, right? So we did have one case where they went to court before and tried to share their case and all of their evidence and all of their data, and the map that they had produced was produced by a different anthropologist who had made a decision with them that they didn't really want to put the colonist communities on the map, right? They're illegal. We're not going to put them on the map. But because they failed to put it on the map, the court mandated that they go back and redo the whole entire thing, right? So we had to go back and redo the whole entire thing. So to that regard, we had to incorporate all of their different kinds of claims. Okay, all right. So let's take a look at their first map. You look at this map, you'll see along the outside we've got a red line, right? We like to work in straight lines. Curvy lines are irritating in GIS, I think. How many people know GIS, work with GIS? Okay, well, I encourage you all to learn it, right? You know that right over here, they started the biggest software company for GIS, right? Esri, Jack Dangermond. And you know, he just recently, do you know this? He recently donated a server for K through 12, right? So you're all kind of late to the table here. Time to catch up, right? All right. So we would get to these points where we knew they were border markers and we'd have to make a turn that wasn't going to be straight and we had to take a waypoint, yeah? So these are all considered waypoints, these little asterisks, those red asterisks, okay? And linking them all up, then we've got our polygon of their land claim. Their total land claim in the beginning was 150,000 hectares, right? Got cut back to 90,000 hectares. Part of it was that argument that I already mentioned of the government saying, this is too much land for too few people, right? Well, we did say they depend 75 or 74% on the rainforest for their survival. It wasn't enough to maintain that entire claim, okay? All right, so also, if you look at the details of this map, you'll see little house-looking things. You see that? Yeah, and then we have empty houses as well. So my understanding, I believe these empty houses were your seasonal houses where you have your crops, your family crops. You're going to move into the forest and harvest your crops when harvest is ready, and then you're going to come back to the main town. This is part of the semi-nomadicness of their character, right? The other aspect was moving every 25 years, right? Okay. All right, so that's our first map. Second map I wanted you to take a look at was a bit of an example on that biological corridor. Do you remember us talking about the Mesoamerican biological corridor? Do you remember what a biological corridor is? In ecosystems, we prefer to link them up with biological corridors. The corridors are basically pathways that species migrate back and forth. So to say that our forests don't move and don't migrate is a complete lie. They do quite a bit. And they need those critical areas to be protected to maintain the integrity of species and the genetic diversity of those species groups, okay? So looking at this, you'll see Panama starts right here, right? So we've got Amazon coming out to this area, and then we've got these protected areas, if you see they're all in green, going all the way up into the Petén and the lower Mexico area of Oaxaca, right? This is a critical piece, is the Raman Creole indigenous people. Here also, the Ulua. And there's actually forest in between these parts, okay? If we take away the Awas, we're taking away one of the biggest migratory paths and really shrinking down that broadleaf rainforest to a very small area, okay? You saw maybe the clip of the video on before I started class, and it had those pictures of the lungs. Do you see the lungs, right? Made out of the forest areas, right? So that's what we're talking about there, okay? All right, now looking at just the Nicaraguan map, to remind you of the area, right? This light green area up here that the cursor is on, that's the Boswas Biosphere Reserve. We have an area here called the Sislaya National Park that was in existence way before, right? And then this area around here that's kind of orangey, you see that? That's called the buffer zone. Remember when we were talking about cattle projects that were being promoted by the EU in the buffer zone, how it was just denuding everything? That's where that was, right? Nowadays, that buffer zone is gone. In the beginning, we had actually a forested buffer zone, right? Okay. So, whoops, my bad. So looking at some of the photographs from our work, right, we had to teach people how to read topographic maps, okay? Because basically what we were doing was drawing a new topographic map. And we needed to be able to take the GPS points of their sacred sites at various levels of elevation, right? And other areas that were important to them, be it family farms or caves or rivers or places where they went gold mining, right? Would you put places where you go gold mining on a map? No way. Like, you'd be like, duh, right? Right? We had a project of indigenous people mapping plant areas on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. And the indigenous people there decided they wanted their map to be kept secret because it identified everywhere that they went to collect all of their most sacred and widely used plants, including salal, which is widely used by florists nowadays, yeah? But these guys were different. They said, no, we're putting it on the map. The heck, man, right? No, they said, if we put it on the map that we know that we have, by example, we have an altar made completely of gold, and they know that we know where it is, we're putting it on the map, and if anything ever happens to it, we know, right? They know. There's no question it was ours. Even the government knows, right? That's an interesting approach, right? Wouldn't have been my approach, but that's what they decided, right? And I'm glad that they decided that way, okay? That'd be the difference between me from an outsider's position and them having that experience and knowing what they wanted, right? Here's our example of cognitive mapping, right? Where we're just taking a big piece of paper and drawing the areas of the rivers that we know and how they bend and curve. And from there, once we've gotten our outline, we're going to look at developing hunting trails, areas where we plant things, areas where we don't go, right? That's part of our land use mapping. I love this map. I love this picture. A couple things I love about it. One, if you read, Waulapani, right there. You see that? The A is covered up, right? Waulapani. Do you remember what Waula meant? Do you remember what the Waula was? the anaconda with feathers, right? Enormous in the Mayagna culture that if you come into contact with it, immediately killed, right? We have the hombre grande, but we also have the waula. This is fascinating. If you remember, we took the inner core conservation zone that they had identified, and they called it the waula zone. They said, it's called the waula zone. Would you want to go there? No, obviously, right? What idiot would remember the Hollywood movies about anacondas and want to go there, right? I guess for curiosity, maybe. Okay? But this said, this is where we've cited it. It's been cited. And this is where it was. And this is where the story was that we told you that we wrote down as part of our evidence, right? So this is considered a sacred site. Also, I love the fact that if you look right over here on the map, you see the numbers 1890. What they've done with this map, you don't see the overall picture of the map. What they've done with this map is they've mapped their movement over time. And for us in human rights, it's showing that we have been present on this land, and this is how we have moved over time. And here's the evidence, and we can go and look at it, and we can bring it into court if you want, right? The other thing that I love about this map is that it's in crayon. Why do I like that? Because they don't need any fancy technology to defend their land rights. It's a matter of getting things down on paper, pen, crayon, as it were, to make it a visual presentation to people that, hey, this is our claim, and here it is, right? This is a map that was done years ago, okay? Before we even started talking about things called land ownership. This is a map that was developed off of a paper bark tree. They rip the sides of the paper bark off and they bang it, right? And it's called tuno. They can make an art with it, but this group, they took and made a map with it. This is one of their ancient ancestral maps that they made a long time ago. Also another piece of evidence for them, yeah? The ink and the mark and the colors that you see are from plants. Oop, doing that. All right. Okay, let's see here. Okay, now let's take a look at some more of their maps. We have some crossing claims, right? During this conflict of 10 years, we had indigenous people on both sides of the coin. And we had Mayagna, and we had Miskitu, and we had all kinds of groups. And when people squatted, it wasn't just those from the Pacific coast. We also had Miskitu that squatted. Technically indigenous. Didn't have the legal right to that area, but under Nicaraguan law considered indigenous, right? So they were squatting there and claiming it as their right to indigenous land. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, got 4 over here, and a big claim right here, and a small little one out here, right? Okay, so that's one of our maps of crossing claims. Here's another map of more colonists crossing claims. If you know the map, you'll know that over here is the main town. Yeah, you see my little scroller? Yeah. And the vast majority of their home use is in this area. This area out here that nobody's claiming, pretty far out in the wilderness. Not a lot going on out there at all, right? So we've got this map of crossing claims, this map of even more crossing claims, and then we've got the government's map. Yeah, it's not completely the government's map because we did it, right? So, but it represents their logging concessions. So if you look at the total area in red and the logging concessions, we've got a tiny little area up at the top where the town is, and an even smaller area over here than what we had with the crossing claims of neighboring areas. So we've got a lot to contend with. People living all over the territory, the government with all kinds of logging concessions, right? It's a problem. When we did the work with the territories in the Awas, they developed their land use map. This is their land use map. Remember, they couldn't get ownership without showing how they were going to use it and that they were going to use it well, right? Had they had a map that said this is where we're going to cut down all the trees, no way would they have gotten ownership, right? So you see this inner area here, this green area here, that's the WALA zone, the Inner Conservation Corps zone. Okay, that's where that anaconda lives, and Hombre Grande. Had to do that with Awas Tingni as well. So we had to put together our land use map of where they had their traditional stands of rainforest that were untouched, where they had areas of agriculture, right? And where they had their towns, where they were allowed to go and not allowed to go according to their culture, okay? So in the end, they came up with their own traditional map of land use. Kind of interesting, you see that their map goes beyond their boundaries. You see that? You can see their original claim, maybe, if you see that. No? Not the claim that they were left with, okay? All right. So in this process, I worked with an anthropologist who's now retired. He was out of Idaho State University. His name's Dr. Anthony Stocks. I've included a link to one of his pieces on our work here. If you remember, if you're going to read it, if you remember our stats, anything that's less than or equal to 0.05 is significant, you'll see those stats in there, okay? So he talks about some of the statistical tests that we use in what I'm about to present to you. So just so you remember the value of a p-value, all right? So worked with the Nature Conservancy in a lot of the work that we did. We found that there were about 25,000 indigenous people living within the Awas. Remember when we first declared it as a park, we thought there were maybe 2,000 to 3,000 people living there, and the idea was to move them, right? 25,000, a lot more difficult. Buffer zone, even greater. Then we found some things out in the household surveys that you would find surprising. And thinking about it for a minute, remember we went door to door with the Awas Tingni territory, right? How did we find out about the colonists? We had to do the same thing with them. Can't go to court without recognizing what your neighbors are and who they are and what their needs are too. And to demonstrate that you're incorporating all that understanding, right? So we had to do the same thing with the indigenous areas as with the colonist areas. Contentious to say the least, right? You show up and say, oh, we're working with this territory because they're arguing for their rights to land. We need your data, right? Had to go through a lot just to make sure that all the colonists are showing up and we're getting all their data. Worst comes to worst, we got to fly over with an airplane and get aerial pictures to try and make any assessment of areas that we can't get any data from. Easily done, right? In the process, we find 39% of indigenous are illiterate. We'll flip that and say 60% are literate, right? Instead of the needs way, we'll flip it to the other side. 60% of the indigenous people are literate, know how to read and write. Shockingly, only 18% of colonists are. Wow, do you find that confusing? Okay, let's talk about it for a minute. 10 years, Civil War. Large majority of people entered into military service without even graduating from high school. I had security guards that hadn't not even graduated from grade school, not even 6th grade. Don't know how to read and write completely, okay? So if you're going to be part of a group that instead of going off to school like the other kids, you're ending up to going into the military service, you might not learn how to read and write like everybody else was planned on doing. So we found that Those squatters that were there were those that were in the military service that had just stayed, right? Don't want to go home. This is great. Like this place. We're going to stay, right? So different from the vast majority of the country, this group was not as well educated and therefore also suffered from some other aspects of critical thinking issues that you could imagine in dealing with land conflict. Okay? Think about even signing documents, what that means when you can't even read it. Yeah? All right. So we also noticed that the property was quite different in both sides. With the colonist areas, we had this understanding of property ownership. I own it outright. I get to pass it on to my kids, right? With the indigenous side, we had multi-communal ownership, right? And private property was just not there, okay? So, let's see here. In terms of the Awas Tingni territory and all of the other indigenous territories that were titled, they're basically at a stage where they're waiting for decolonization. Maybe I mentioned it before. We had a couple of attempts at decolonization. It was an aggressive way of taking care of the issue. We had military and police go into the area of Raman Creole, and basically we had between 11 and 15 people end up in the hospital. Everybody shot at each other, right? It was a bad deal. Got a pin stuck in my hair. No wonder. What is wrong with me? This is weird. All right. Pardon me. So, in terms of following through with the rest of what we started, we will have to follow through with decolonization. It's been written into the law. It even says that after 6 months of receiving title, they're guaranteed decolonization. So technically right now we can file yet another lawsuit against the country. We started thinking about doing this. We submitted another complaint to the UN Special Rapporteur. He made plans to come into the country, and the country said, no. No, right? This is one of our first beginning points of watching Nicaragua refuse to have human rights delegates come into country, right? Since that, we've been on hold, right? And we've been talking about renewing that lawsuit and going back to court for the lack of decolonization. But again, like I said earlier, in order to decolonize, we need to have a plan, right? We need to have a place for people to go. We need to have a plan, and we need to have some support for that, right? So that's where we are in Nicaragua. And interestingly enough, the methods that we use there in Awas Tingni have been massified around the world. We have projects just exactly like this going all over Panama, right? And other areas of Central America, Europe, even getting into the Middle East, Africa as well, and Australia, okay? So this is a kind of methodology that's been spread around the world, all right? Okay, so now I'm going to show you two pieces. One, the clip, the 15-minute clip on Awas Tingni that my employee did, and then the trailer for El Canto de Basoas, okay? So let's go with this first.
Awas Tingni is a Somo-Mayagna community of about 120 families, perched on the banks of the Wawa River, some 90 kilometers northeast of Puerto Cabezas. This isolated community, virtually unknown until recently, has put Nicaragua in the limelight of international jurisprudence. In 1993, this indigenous community began a tenacious legal battle against logging concessions that were granted in their territory to a company called Madensa. Later, in 1995, they opposed another logging concession awarded to the Solcarta company. After a 3-year legal fight, the case was heard by the International Court of Human Rights, part of the OAS, which ruled in favor of the indigenous community and against the government of Nicaragua. The August 2001 ruling found the state of Nicaragua guilty of issuing logging concessions without the community's consent and obligated the Nicaraguan government to indemnify Awas Tingni.
Otorgaron un permiso para 62,000 hectáreas, aquí nomás al oeste de nuestra comunidad. Entonces, ese fue que nosotros hemos hecho una demanda ante el gobierno. A la vez, nosotros estamos emocionados, toda la gente de esta comunidad, porque nunca en nuestra vida los mayanas hemos tenido como esta oportunidad de ir al juicio y después sacar una sentencia. Sí, es decir que tenemos un derecho pleno para reclamar cualquier caso por nuestra tierra.
The most important thing is that this judgment recognizes the ancestral rights of the indigenous people over their land and resources. As part of the ruling, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ordered the government of Nicaragua to map out and set the boundaries of the indigenous territory of Awas Tingni.
Para nosotros en Nicaragua, la sentencia de Awas Tingni y posteriormente la aprobación de la ley que regula el régimen de propiedad comunal es un hecho, es un precedente no solo importante para Nicaragua, sino importante para los pueblos indígenas de todo el mundo. Primero porque la sentencia de Awas Tingni reconoce el derecho ancestral. ¿Qué quiere decir? Que con o sin título, el derecho territorial de los pueblos indígenas está reconocido.
Anthony Stokes, an anthropologist from the US, has a lot of experience with territorial demarcation and has worked extensively in Nicaragua. From 1993 to 1998, he produced maps of indigenous territories in the Bosa Awas Nature Reserve and is now in charge of the demarcation of Awas Tingni. ¿Y cuánto tiempo creo que puede durar hasta demarcar?
Hasta terminar el proceso? Eso es pura cuestión política entre el gobierno y los vecinos. Bueno, la gente de la RAN puede hacerlo más fácil o más difícil. Si las comunidades que tienen reclamos en traslape, si no hacen un trato con Awas Tingni y obstaculan el proceso en Awas Tingni, estoy cierto que va a demorar la demarcación de todo la RAN. Si las comunidades colaboran en hacer su trato y hacer algo razonable, un acuerdo con Awas Tingni, y va muy suavemente, yo creo que en algunos pocos años se puede ver que casi toda la RAN está que cuestión de tenencia de tierra está muy avanzada.
That's what happened.
But the indigenous land demarcation process in the Caribbean coast is only just beginning for the Awas Tingni case. For 3 years, the indigenous people of the coast tried to promote the demarcation law, but it was kept under wraps in the National Assembly. Then in December of 2002, in a moment of euphoria following the annulment of former President Aliman's political immunity, Sandinista legislators, together with other liberal adversaries, unexpectedly passed Law 445, known as the demarcation law.
El día de la aprobación, que fue el 13 de diciembre, yo estuve ahí.
It's the one law that was passed after all the consultation,
Es
yes?
cierto que la reglamentación de la ley ya debería haber estado, pero aunque no se ha avanzado, al menos lo logramos arrancar en la Asamblea Nacional y esta parte importante.
Approval of the demarcation law was a triumph for the people of the Caribbean coast, but it's a headache for central government because it has opened up a Pandora's box in relation to indigenous land rights and control over natural resources.
Con la ley nuestra, la ley 445, ese derecho ya reconocido de alguna forma con la sentencia, viene a definirse el mecanismo de cómo se aplica en el caso de Nicaragua. Entonces yo creo que estamos muy adelantados en relación con la legislación internacional. Es un caso que efectivamente es un desafío para la gente de Nicaragua poder poner en práctica esta ley.
The autonomous regions of Nicaragua cover about half of the national territory and have enormous potential in terms of natural resources, such as fish, mineral, timber, and some say even oil. Enforcement of this law, therefore, is a source of conflict and tension between the central government and the autonomous authorities.
El Estado nicaragüense, no importa qué partido lo gobierne, tiene un compromiso histórico con los pueblos indígenas y comunidades étnicas de la costa atlántica de titular. Es claro el concepto de territorio que se establece ahí en uno de los artículos de la ley 445, que el territorio indígena comprende todas las áreas de uso, sobrevivencia, pesca y espiritualidad, inclusive porque el descanso, todo lo que es el concepto de territorio. Entonces, tampoco podemos vender la idea de que los indígenas están reclamando solo la tierra donde tienen la casa o donde cultivan, pero también la tierra donde cazan, la tierra donde están sus restos de religiosos, sus templos, todo eso lo comprende. Pero de ninguna manera estamos pensando en la loquera que teníamos en los años 80, cuando estábamos muy jóvenes, que creíamos que podíamos recuperar dentro de Nicaragua todas las tierras, pues, que tocaríamos Huaslal.
In this debate over indigenous territories, there are much more extreme positions than those of Dr. Law. The Mosquito Council of Elders and some indigenous academics are much more radical, invoking the 1860 Managua Treaty, as well as the Harrison and Tamigano Treaty of 1905.
Nicaragua nos ha destruido y las leyes y el convenio que se hizo con Nicaragua no lo ha cumplido. Al no cumplirse ese tratado con nosotros tenemos todo el derecho para disolver ese tratado. Y eso es lo que ha hecho el Consejo de Ancianos. Por lo tanto, en estos momentos, este es un territorio bajo soberanía indígena.
Porque en el mundo tenemos ejemplos de lo que ocurre cuando las nacionalidades dentro de un territorio no se entienden qué es lo que ocurre. Realmente nosotros no estamos, no nos sentimos y a la larga no queremos estar en este estado de que hemos hablado hoy y que nunca en la historia no ha tomado en cuenta.
The demarcation law has created enormous expectations amongst the people of the coast region. According to this law, the central government will not be able to issue any type of concession without the approval from the regional, municipal, or communal authorities in this part of the country.
That's street prayer and informed consent.
This law establishes that 25% of any income generated by the use of the area's natural resources will go to the communities. Another 25% will go to the municipality, and the regional and central governments will divide the remainder. Some propose that the whole Caribbean coast of Nicaragua should be recognized as indigenous and ethnic territory, but authorities and the autonomous governments who are leading this complex process are much more cautious.
Yo creo que en principio aquí se debe de definir que todo el pueblo, todas las que son las tierras comunes que fueron incorporadas a Nicaragua son tierras indígenas. Ahí debe ser el punto de partida. Aquí hay una serie de conflictos y mi preocupación es que si no manejamos esto de manera correcta, puede surgir un conflicto étnico, interétnico.
Algunos tienen la visión de que esas tierras son mías, pero allá hasta donde el ojo da. Y no es así. O sea, lo que ellos han conservado tradicionalmente como tierras de ellos, pues es lo que se va a reconocer. Lo que estamos evitando en todo caso es que ellos entren en conflicto con otros territorios.
While in the Pacific region, land is seen as private property or as state-owned. For the indigenous people, many of these territories are sacred and can't be sold or taken away from them. These are the guiding principles of Law 445. It means that even if there are no land deeds, indigenous territories cannot be sold, and therefore any previous transaction or sales of these lands must be reviewed one by one.
That's a lot of work.
La ley habla de que quedan invalidadas todas las ventas de tierras y los títulos que fueron otorgados desde 1987. A partir de ahí, ninguna es legal. Entonces, ahorita nosotros le solicitamos a la Corte Suprema de Justicia también que intercediera sobre los jueces, sobre los notarios, diciéndole que no deben hacer títulos sustitutorios para nada en nuestras regiones, porque entonces ellos estarían contrariando la ley y nos meterían en problemas legales.
However, the purchase and sale of land using previous land titles is common. A case in point is that of Greek investor Peter Sokos, who bought 7 of the Pearl Key, Frenchman Key, and Pigeon Key just outside Bluefield. He also has property in Punta Aguila.
Well, Peter took a problem with us, serious problem, because this piece of land was sell around is Indian territory.
Peter Stokos, falta de respeto para los trabajadores. Ellos traen su ingeniero y hace su lindero, pone su mojón sin consultar. Más bien, no quiere que los ramas caminen en la costa. Y cuando nosotros sabemos muy bien que la costa es para todo el mundo.
However, Peter Martinez, Sokos' lawyer, defends his client and says that the sale of his property was done legally.
Ha tenido que enfrentar a los políticos de turno que han tratado de manipular los intereses de los comunitarios y ha tenido que enfrentar al Estado mismo, compuestos en cierta medida de políticos que tienen intereses económicos creados en la zona. Aquí se está tratando de decir que los cayos están dentro de 4 regímenes de propiedad reconocidos en la Constitución política distintas, ¿no? Mientras los privados tienen su título, la comunidad lo reclama como tal, el municipio lo reclama como tierra y el Estado lo reclama incluso en los juzgados.
The issue of land tenure and the enforcement of Law 445 is only one of the problems facing the Caribbean region, which has the highest poverty rates in the country and also has become a transit route for drug trafficking. To move forward, this situation must be viewed as a national problem, rather than one that only concerns the people of the coast. Since 2002, the central government has made very little efforts to pursue the indigenous land demarcation and has not allotted any significant budget to this issue. However, the indigenous communities have kept on going with the demarcation of their lands, and 3 of the 6 indigenous territories of Awas have been granted their land titles at last. The policy of central government towards the Caribbean has always been one of contempt, and their inhabitants are usually treated as second-class citizens. Taking into consideration that the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua represents half the national territory, with most of the country's natural resources, it is quite shocking what little importance the serious issue is being given. The growing tensions between indigenous people and settlers coming in from the west who are destroying their ancestral habitat could quite easily end in a bloodbath if this problem isn't addressed.
Nosotros hemos luchado, aunque otras comunidades no sabían por qué estamos peleando o reclamando por nuestros derechos. Ahora sí dieron cuenta, después del juicio, dieron cuenta, ahora todo el mundo quiere su demarcación, ¿verdad?
Hoy día nosotros los ramas tienen la esperanza en esa demarcación territorial. La ley ya lo probaron, los dictámenes ya lo probaron. Por eso nosotros ahorita tienen la esperanza que con esa ley nosotros podemos demarcarnos.
All right. So now you got a bit of a review. Also, one of the things that we did in terms of raising the voice and getting knowledge out there was to put together films and movies. And this one involved a gentleman that is a well-known singer. You can see the film on YouTube.
En el 2013 se me
It's
dio
a
la
trailer
oportunidad de
only.
poder viajar a la zona núcleo de Awas junto con 2 amigos de Estados Unidos, que son ingenieros de sonido, Bob e Easy, para hacer la primera grabación profesional de música mayana.
So this is a singer, and he's going into the communities to record local singing. And it's the first time that he's getting to know the area, the place, the people. And he ends up becoming a huge advocate for the place and the people. So this is 2 minutes. It's Spanish, but it's got a beautiful little message here.
Di Sasma, di Maya, Yulma Kiri, Dakaya. Di Sasma, di Maya, Yulma Kiri, Dakaya. Takidya awama yadana yado.
Si de verdad amamos a nuestros hijos, si de verdad amamos Nicaragua, tenemos que saltar Bossa Nova.
Yes. Save Bossa Was. All right. So that's all I have for you today. And I will see you in